In the cozy Maplewood diner, Linda Parker, a 66-year-old waitress, quietly ensures a mysterious boy, Ethan, never goes hungry, slipping him extra meals daily. As weeks pass, her kindness softens Ethan's guarded demeanor, but the town's whispers grow louder, questioning her generosity. Just as Ethan becomes a fixture, he vanishes, leaving Linda haunted by doubts. Did she help enough? Where is he now? Then one chilling morning, four black SUVs arrive and a uniformed man steps inside, seeking Linda. His words unravel a heart-wrenching truth about Ethan's past, leaving the diner and Linda forever changed. What secret does he carry? Thank you for joining Linda's heartfelt journey. If her story of quiet kindness inspired you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that celebrate compassion. Share your own stories of kindness in the comments. We'd love to hear them. Support our channel to keep these tales alive. The dawn broke over Maplewood, its soft golden light spilling through the diner's wide windows, bathing the small town in a quiet glow. Inside, the air was rich with the comforting sense of sizzling bacon, freshly brewed coffee, and the warm, buttery aroma of buttermilk pancakes. Linda Parker, at 66, moved through the diner with a grace born of decades spent navigating its narrow aisles. Her hands, steady and sure, tied her apron with a practiced knot as she greeted the morning regulars with a warmth that felt like an embrace. "Morning, Joe," she said, her voice soft but carrying a kindness that lingered. She set a steaming mug of black coffee before an older man by the window, his weathered hands curling around it, soaking in its warmth. "Morning, Linda. Feels like a cold one's brewing," Joe replied, his voice rough but warm, his eyes squinting at the frost-kissed world beyond the glass. "October in Maine doesn't play nice," Linda said with a gentle smile, already turning to refill another customer's cup, her movements fluid yet deliberate. The bell above the door chimed, a sound as familiar as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She expected Ed from the hardware store, his usual grumble about the weather, or maybe young Hannah rushing in before her bakery shift. But instead her gaze landed on a stranger, a boy, no more than 9, stepping in from the biting morning chill. His jacket, threadbare at the elbows, hung loosely on his slight frame, and an oversized backpack dragged behind him, too heavy for his narrow shoulders. He moved with a quiet caution, slipping into the corner booth furthest from the door, as if trying to make himself invisible. Linda watched from behind the counter as he pulled out a book, its pages worn and corners curled from countless readings. His small hands smoothed the pages with a tenderness that tugged at her heart. His head bowed low, as if the world outside those pages was too much to bear. When a waitress approached with a menu, the boy shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Just water, please," he said, his eyes flicking up for only a moment before retreating to the safety of his book. Linda's chest tightened. There was something in his posture, in the way he seemed to shrink into himself, that stirred a memory of her own youth. Days when hunger gnawed at her stomach and pride kept her silent. "You got it, honey," she said, filling a glass with water and adding a paper straw before placing it gently on his table. The boy murmured a faint "thank you," his voice so soft it seemed to dissolve into the air, and then he was back to his book, hunched over as if shielding himself from the world's gaze. Linda returned to the counter, but her eyes kept drifting to the boy. She noticed how his shoulders tensed each time the door chimed, how his gaze darted toward the kitchen whenever a plate emerged, piled high with golden eggs or crispy bacon. It was a hunger she recognized, not just for food, but for a moment of safety, of belonging. Without a word, she slipped into the kitchen. "Tom," she called to the cook, who was flipping an omelet with a practiced flick. "We got an extra order of toast, right?" Tom raised an eyebrow, his spatula pausing. "Do we?" he asked, catching the knowing glint in her eye. "We do now," Linda said, her lips curving into a small, conspiratorial smile. Moments later, she carried a plate of warm, buttered toast to the boy's table, setting it down with a casual air. "Kitchen messed up again," she said lightly, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Hate to see this go to waste." The boy's eyes flicked up, moving between the plate and Linda's face. For a heartbeat, suspicion clouded his expression, his small frame tensing as if bracing for a catch. But hunger was a stronger force. He gave a barely perceptible nod. his hands reaching for the toast with a quiet urgency that broke Linda's heart just a little. She turned back to the counter, pouring another coffee for Joe, but her thoughts stayed with the boy. For the first time that morning, a quiet warmth bloomed in her chest, the kind that comes from doing something good, no matter how small. By the end of the week, Linda had memorized the boy's routine as if it were her own. Just after 7, the diner's bell would jingle softly, and there he'd be, slipping through the door with his worn jacket and oversized backpack. She'd started calling him Ethan in her mind, a name that felt soft yet sturdy, though she hadn't yet asked for his real one. He'd settle into the corner booth, always the same one, clutching his tattered book like a shield. Each day he ordered only water, his voice so quiet it seemed to apologize for taking up space. And each day Linda ensured the kitchen accidentally prepared something extra, sometimes oatmeal sprinkled with brown sugar and raisins, other times scrambled eggs, fluffy and warm. She'd deliver it with the same casual excuse, kitchen goofed again. Each time, Ethan's eyes would flicker with that mix of suspicion and gratitude, though the suspicion softened a little more each day, as if he was beginning to trust the kindness she offered. One morning, as Linda set a plate of eggs and toast before him, the diner's familiar hum faltered. The chatter of regulars faded, forks hovering midair. Outside, the windows flashed with the gleam of black as 4 SUVs rolled into the lot, their engines idling with a low, ominous hum. Linda's hands froze on the counter, the rag she'd been using forgotten. The door swung open, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped inside, his boots heavy on the linoleum. His eyes swept the room, sharp and deliberate, before settling on her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made her breath catch. "Are you Linda Parker?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the morning fog rolling over Maplewood. Linda set the rag down, her heart stuttering, though she couldn't yet name the unease that gripped her. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the diner, and in that moment the warmth she'd felt from helping Ethan flickered, overshadowed by something unknown, something that felt like it could change everything. In the quiet hum of the Maplewood diner, where the scent of frying bacon mingled with the soft clatter of plates, Linda moved with the ease of someone who knew every inch of the place. Each morning she'd set a small plate of scrambled eggs, fluffy and golden, or a modest stack of pancakes, a pat of butter melting into a glossy pool atop them, in front of Ethan. She'd place it gently on his table, her voice carrying a light, practiced warmth. "Tom got distracted again," she'd say, offering a slight shrug as if it were no big deal, just a kitchen mix-up. "Figured you could help us out." It was her way of softening the moment, of making the act feel like a favor to her rather than charity for him. She could see the tension in Ethan's frame, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, and she wanted to ease it, even if just for the duration of a meal. At first, Ethan was a bundle of nerves. His eyes darted around the diner, scanning the faces of strangers as if expecting someone to challenge his presence, to demand he justify his place at the corner booth. His fingers hovered over the table, hesitant, as if touching the fork might commit him to something he wasn't ready for. But day by day, that wariness softened. By the second week, he no longer waited for Linda to turn away before reaching for the fork. His movements grew smoother, less guarded, as if the simple rhythm of a hot meal was teaching him to trust the space around him. The transformation was subtle, but to Linda, who noticed everything, it was as clear as the morning light streaming through the diner's wide windows. The regulars at Maplewood weren't oblivious. Joe, a grizzled man who always claimed the window seat, was the first to pick up on it. One morning, as Linda poured steaming coffee into his chipped mug, he tilted his head toward Ethan's booth. "Looks like you've got yourself a new helper back there," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Linda followed his gaze, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Yeah, seems like it," she replied, her tone neutral, but her eyes lingering on Ethan, who sat hunched over his plate, eating slowly, deliberately. Joe leaned back, sipping his coffee. "Quiet kid," he mused. "Polite, though." Well, there was a hint of approval in his voice, but also curiosity, the kind that small-town folks couldn't help but feel when something new stirred the familiar rhythm of their days. By the third week, the whispers had taken root. Margaret, who ran the flower shop down the street, leaned over the counter as she handed Linda her breakfast check. "Is that the same boy every morning?" she asked, her voice low, as if Ethan might overhear from across the room. Her brows furrowed, not with malice, but with the concern of someone who'd seen the world's sharper edges. Linda just nodded, her hands busy wiping down the counter. "Linda's got herself a charity case," Ed from the hardware store muttered to another customer, his voice carrying just enough to sting. He watched as Linda set a fresh plate of pancakes in front of Ethan, the butter melting into golden rivulets. Even Tom, the cook, who spent his days flipping eggs and barking orders in the kitchen, raised an eyebrow one morning. "You're running quite a tab for that kid," he said, his tone gruff but not cruel. Linda waved him off, her smile tight. "Don't worry about it, Tom. I'll handle it." But the comments kept coming, like flies buzzing around a picnic. "Careful, Linda," Margaret warned one morning as she slid into her usual booth, her voice soft but pointed. "You start giving too much away, they'll come to expect it." The next day, Ed was at it again, shaking his head over his coffee. "Kids these days," he grumbled. "Back when I was his age, you didn't eat if you didn't earn it." His words carried the weight of a man who'd grown up in a world where survival meant proving your worth every day. Linda heard them all, their judgments and warnings piling up like dishes in the sink, but she brushed them off like crumbs from the counter. What did they know? They hadn't seen Ethan the first day he'd walked in. His shoulders knotted so tightly it was as if he were bracing for a blow. They hadn't noticed the way his eyes stayed glued to his plate, as if he feared someone might snatch it away. They hadn't seen the way his hands trembled slightly that first week, or how, over time, the simple act of a warm meal had begun to unravel that tension, letting him sit a little straighter, breathe a little easier. Linda's heart carried its own memories, ones she rarely spoke of but never forgot. She thought often of her own childhood, of winters so cold the windows frosted over inside, of her parents' quiet worry as they stretched every dollar to keep the heat on. She remembered the bags of groceries that appeared on their back porch, left by neighbors who never knocked, never asked for thanks. She remembered the shame that had burned in her chest, the gnawing hunger that felt like a secret she had to keep. Back then, she'd vowed to never let anyone feel that way if she could help it. So now, as she moved through the diner, delivering plates and refilling coffee, she kept an eye on Ethan. She never hovered, never pressed him with questions. She simply made sure that when he was there, a plate was in front of him, warm and full. To her, it wasn't charity, it was just human. Over the weeks, Ethan began to change in ways that were small but profound. His eyes, once skittish, now met hers for a fleeting moment when she set down his plate. His shoulders, once rigid, began to relax, as if the weight of the world was just a little lighter. One morning, as she placed a bowl of oatmeal topped with fresh berries in front of him, he offered a brief, almost imperceptible smile, a flicker of trust that felt like a victory. Linda noticed. She always noticed. The town could whisper, gossip, judge, but she didn't waver. Each night, she slipped a few dollars from her tips into the register to cover Ethan's meals. She set aside her own wants, the new winter coat she'd been eyeing, the dentist appointment she kept putting off, and put the boy first. In her mind, the world had enough people asking questions, setting conditions, weighing worth. In her little corner of the diner, a hot meal, a full belly, and a quiet place to sit came without strings attached. It was a Thursday morning when the tension that had been simmering finally broke. Linda had just set down Ethan's usual plate of pancakes, the butter melting into golden pools, and was pouring coffee for Joe when Tom's voice cut through the hum of the diner. "Linda," he called from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on his apron, his tone sharper than usual. She turned, her heart sinking slightly, knowing what was coming. The whispers, the warnings, the sideways glances, they'd been building and now they were spilling over. But Linda stood firm, her gaze steady, ready to face whatever came next. Because for her, it was enough to know that Ethan, for a moment each morning, could sit and eat without looking over his shoulder. And that, in the end, was worth everything. Tom stood in the cramped back office of the Maplewood diner, his hands still damp from wiping them on a threadbare towel. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, betraying the weight of a long day, though his eyes held a flicker of unease as he glanced toward Linda. She set the coffee pot down with a soft clink on the counter, her movements deliberate, sensing the gravity in his posture. Without a word, she followed him into the office, the hum of the diner fading behind her. The small room was a chaotic nest of papers, receipts, and half-empty coffee mugs, the desk barely holding its own under the clutter. Tom leaned against it, his face taut, lines deepening around his mouth as he wrestled with what he needed to say. Linda Baum, gosh, diggin'. We need to have a talk, he began, his voice low but firm, like a man trying to balance authority with reluctance. She crossed her arms loosely, not defensive but guarded, her hazel eyes studying him as she waited. Her silence was patient, a quiet invitation for him to continue. Tom shifted his weight, the desk creaking under him. Look, I've got no issue with you helping people. You've got a good heart, everyone knows that. But it's getting noticed. His gaze sharpened, though there was a trace of sympathy in it. That kid, Ethan, he's been coming in every single day for weeks now, and every day you're slipping him free food. Linda's lips parted, a protest forming, but Tom raised a hand, cutting her off gently. Hold on, hear me out. I'm not saying I don't respect what you're doing. I do. It's admirable, Linda, truly. But this place? He gestured vaguely toward the diner beyond the door. It's a business, not a charity. We can't afford to be a soup kitchen. Word's already spreading, and if we're not careful, we'll have half the town's hard luck cases lining up at the door, expecting handouts. His words carried the weight of pragmatism, but beneath them, Linda could sense his conflict, a man torn between his ledger and his conscience. She nodded quietly, her thoughts swirling. Ethan's face flashed in her mind, the way he hunched over his tattered paperback, his thin frame barely filling the booth, his eyes darting nervously as if he expected someone to tell him to leave. She thought of the pancakes she'd set in front of him that morning, the way his fingers hesitated before picking up the fork, as if he didn't quite believe the meal was his. Tom's voice pulled her back. Here's the deal, he said, his tone softening just a fraction, like a man conceding ground he didn't want to give. I can't have the diner footing the bill for this, but if you want to keep it up, you can cover it out of your tips. That's your choice. Linda met his gaze, her eyes steady, resolute. The offer wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and fairness was something she could work with. That's reasonable, Tom, she said, her voice calm but firm. 1 meal a day. I'll take care of it. Her words were simple, but inside a quiet determination took root. She could make this work. She would. Tom let out a resigned sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though a shadow of doubt lingered in his expression. All right, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. But if it starts messing with your work, or if that kid causes any trouble, we'll have to revisit this. Understood? Linda offered a faint smile, a small gesture that carried more gratitude than she could say. No trouble, she assured him. You'll barely notice he's here. With that, she slipped back into the diner's main room, where the clatter of dishes and the murmur of customers greeted her like an old friend. Ethan was still there, hunched over his book in the corner booth, his fork moving slowly through a stack of pancakes. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and his worn jacket hung loosely on his narrow frame. Linda's heart tightened as she watched him, a mix of protectiveness and quiet resolve settling over her. For now, their unspoken agreement could continue. She moved to clear a nearby table, the knot of tension in her chest loosening just a little, like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But the town of Maplewood was already stirring. Over the weekend, a photo surfaced on Facebook, a snapshot of Ethan's empty booth, a plate of half-eaten toast sitting forlornly in the center. The caption was sharp, cutting. Maplewood Diner, free meals for strays. By Monday, the post had spread like wildfire, spawning a cascade of comments and shares. One post sneered, "Nothing like rewarding freeloaders." Go, Linda. Another, dripping with condescension, added, "She's always been soft, bless her heart. But this is why people take advantage." The words stung, though Linda tried not to let them. She heard the whispers as she walked home from her shift, the air heavy with judgment. In the grocery store, she caught the sideways glances, the pursed lips of neighbors who'd known her for years but now seemed to see her differently. Even in the diner, some regulars hid their Snickers behind menus, their eyes glinting with amusement or disapproval. "Careful, Linda," Margaret warned one morning, her voice low over the rim of her coffee cup. She was a fixture at the diner, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her sharp eyes missing nothing. This town's got a long memory. They'll talk about this for years. Linda forced a small laugh, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. Let them talk, Margaret. It's their favorite pastime. But the words lingered, heavy as the steam rising from her coffee. She could shrug off the gossip in the daylight, but at night, alone in her small apartment above the pharmacy, the weight settled differently. After her shift, Linda would climb the narrow stairs to her home, slip off her work shoes, and feel the ache in her feet mirror the one in her chest. She'd brew a cup of tea, the kettle's whistle a small comfort in the quiet, and settle into the armchair by the window. The town stretched out below, its rhythm familiar yet distant. Porch lights flickered on, a dog barked somewhere in the night, and the world moved on without pause. But sometimes, when the silence pressed too heavily, Linda would reach for the old shoebox on the bookshelf. Inside were her husband Jack's letters, their edges yellowed, their creases worn from years of handling. Jack had been gone for nearly a decade, taken by a heart attack that came without warning, leaving a hole in her life that time had softened but never filled. She unfolded one letter, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. Jack had called her Lynette, a nickname that belonged only to him, a private thread that tied her to a life that now felt like a dream. Sometimes the smallest things remind me why we serve, he had written during his deployment years ago. A man sharing half a sandwich, a stranger offering a blanket on a cold night. I see dignity in those moments, Lynette, dignity that no uniform or medal can give. Her throat tightened as she read, her finger lingering on the word dignity. She could almost hear his voice, steady and warm, carrying the conviction that had defined him. Linda folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the box with a reverence reserved for sacred things. She thought of Ethan, of the way his eyes avoided hers, as if he feared judgment or rejection. She thought of how his shoulders had softened in recent weeks, how he lingered a little longer over his meals, as if the diner had become a small refuge. She thought of the town, too, of the quick judgments, the whispered gossip, the ease with which people forgot what it meant to struggle. The line between dignity and need was thin, and Linda knew it better than most. She'd walked it herself in the years after Jack's death, when grief had made every step feel like wading through mud. Rising from the armchair, she set her empty mug in the sink and glanced out the window one last time. The street below was quiet, the diner's neon sign dark across the road. Tomorrow, she knew, the bell above the door would jingle at 7:15 and Ethan would slip inside, his book tucked under his arm, his steps tentative but certain. And Linda would be ready with a plate of something warm. Pancakes maybe, or eggs scrambled just the way he liked them. No questions asked. Let the town talk. Let them judge. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't about charity or pity. It was about dignity. Hers, Ethan's, and the quiet promise she'd made to Jack's memory. The clock ticked past 7 o'clock a.m., and the Maplewood diner hummed with its usual morning rhythm, but something felt off. Linda Parker barely registered the absence at first, her hands busy pouring coffee and exchanging small talk with the regulars. Yet her eyes kept darting to the door, expecting the familiar sight of a small figure with a worn backpack slipping into the corner booth. By 7:15, then 7:30, the booth remained empty, its cracked red vinyl seats staring back at her like an unspoken question. She told herself he was probably just late, maybe stuck in traffic or nursing a cold at home. The thought brought a fleeting sense of relief, but it didn't settle the faint unease curling in her chest. Without much thought, she signaled to the kitchen to whip up a small stack of pancakes, golden and warm, and place them at his usual spot, the fork neatly aligned on a napkin. Just in case. The plate sat untouched until closing, the butter melting into a glossy pool as the hours dragged on. By the second day, the unease had grown into a quiet knot, tightening with every glance at the empty booth. Linda tried to focus on her work, refilling coffee mugs, scribbling orders, wiping down counters, but her gaze kept drifting to the window, searching the street for a familiar silhouette. She didn't want to admit how much his absence bothered her, how it left a hollow space in the diner's familiar chaos. Still, she couldn't help herself. She brought out another plate, scrambled eggs and toast this time, simple but hearty, and set it at the corner table. The chair stayed slightly pulled out as if inviting him to slide in at any moment, but no one came. The food grew cold, the eggs congealing under the fluorescent lights, and Linda's heart sank a little deeper with each passing hour. On the third day, Tom the cook poked his head out from the kitchen, his voice gentle but firm. "Linda, maybe don't waste the food today." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her resolve wavered. An hour later, a bowl of oatmeal sat steaming at the empty booth, its warmth a quiet plea to the universe that he'd walk through the door. Linda's hands lingered on the table as she wiped it down, her fingers tracing the familiar scratches in the wood. She wondered if she'd been naive, if her small gestures of kindness, offering a meal, a quiet place to sit, had been enough. She hadn't even asked his name, hadn't pressed for details about where he came from or who might be missing him. All she knew was the way his eyes lit up when she set a plate in front of him, the way he'd nod in quiet gratitude before digging in. Now the absence of that small connection felt like a weight she couldn't shake. By the end of the week, the regulars had taken notice. Margaret, with her kind eyes and silver hair, handed Linda her check with a look of pity that stung more than it comforted. "He's probably moved on, dear," she said softly, her voice heavy with the weight of someone who'd seen too many people drift through life. "You did what you could." Ed, on the other hand, was less gentle, his smirk cutting as he sipped his coffee. "Told you so, Linda. Strays don't stick around and once the handouts stop." His words landed like a slap, and Linda forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. She turned back to the counter, scrubbing it harder than necessary, as doubts piled up like dishes in the sink. Had she been foolish to care? Had she crossed some unspoken line, offering too much without asking for anything in return? The questions gnawed at her, each one sharper than the last. She'd never pushed him to talk, never demanded answers. She'd only given him a space to exist, a plate of food to ease whatever burdens he carried. But now it felt like she'd been pouring her heart into a void, feeding a ghost who'd vanished without a trace. The nights grew colder, the autumn air biting as Linda locked up the diner and crossed the street to her small apartment. The town around her was quiet, porch lights casting soft glows against the darkness, windows dimming one by one. Each night her thoughts wandered to him. Ethan, she'd started calling him in her mind, though she'd never learned his real name. Where was he now? Was he safe? Tucked away somewhere warm with someone waiting for him? Or was he alone, shivering in the dark, with no one to notice he was gone? The uncertainty clawed at her, and above all, she wondered if her kindness had ever mattered at all. Had it reached him? Or had it been like tossing pebbles into a river, swallowed up without a ripple? Every morning, despite the doubts, Linda couldn't stop herself. She'd set out a plate, pancakes, eggs, sometimes just toast, and watch it go cold hour after hour. It was a ritual now, a small act of defiance against the growing ache in her chest. On the 10th day, she placed the plate down with a heavy sigh, her hand resting on the back of the chair as she stared at the empty booth. The diner's hum faded into the background, and for a moment it was just her and the absence that had taken root in her heart. Joe, one of the regulars, broke the silence from his spot at the counter. "You've got a good heart, Linda, Tiandem," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Don't let the world take that from you." She nodded, blinking back the tears that burned behind her eyes, and turned away before he could see how much his words meant. That night, as she locked the diner's door and stepped into the chilly street, the weight of the week settled over her like a heavy coat. The town was hushed, the stars sharp against the inky sky, and Linda's thoughts were a tangle of hope and doubt. She didn't know if Ethan was out there, if he was safe, or if he'd ever think of the little diner that had welcomed him. But she held on to the flicker of hope that her kindness had left some mark, however small. The 11th morning dawned colder than ever, the kind of autumn chill that seeped into your bones and made every breath feel sharp. Linda wrapped her scarf tighter as she unlocked the Maplewood diner, her fingers stiff from the cold. She paused at the door, to her eyes scanning the empty street, half expecting to see Ethan's familiar figure rounding the corner. But there was nothing, just the quiet street and the faint glow of dawn. With a sigh, she stepped inside, flipped the sign to open, and began her morning routine, wiping counters, brewing coffee, setting out silverware. Habit pulled her to the corner booth, where she laid out a small stack of pancakes, a pat of butter melting into the golden surface, a glass of milk sitting beside a neatly folded napkin. "Linda," Tom called softly from the kitchen, his tone laced with concern. "You sure you want to keep doing him that?" She offered a faint smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just one more day, Tom." By 7:15, the diner came alive with its usual crowd. Joe sipped his black coffee, Margaret ordered her oatmeal, and Ed buried his nose in the newspaper, muttering about the headlines. The clatter of forks and the murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Then the bell above the door jingled, and Linda's heart leapt for a fleeting moment. But it wasn't Ethan. Instead, a hush fell over the diner, as if the air itself had paused. Every head turned toward the window as four large black SUVs rolled into the parking. Again, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators circling their prey. The engines cut off in unison, and the doors opened with a precision that sent a chill down Linda's spine. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of polished boots echoed against the pavement, each step deliberate and synchronized, as if the men marching forward had carried the weight of something far greater than themselves. Linda, wiping down the counter of her small diner, froze mid-motion, her heart lurching with a heavy, instinctive thud. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a signal, a disruption of the quiet morning routine that wrapped her world in familiarity. She glanced up, her breath catching as a sleek black car pulled up outside, its polished surface gleaming under the gray dawn. The door swung open and out stepped a man whose presence seemed to command the air itself, tall, broad-shouldered, his military uniform adorned with a cascade of ribbons and medals that glinted faintly in the muted light. His face, etched with lines that spoke of years spent in service, held a quiet intensity. His posture was unyielding, straight as a steel beam, and as he adjusted his cap with a precise motion, Linda felt the world tilt slightly, as though the diner's walls had suddenly drawn closer. The bell above the door jangled, its chime slicing through the hush that had fallen over the room. The regulars, usually a hum of soft chatter and clinking mugs, went still. Coffee cups hovered halfway to lips, forks paused mid-bite, and all eyes turned toward the stranger. In the kitchen, Tom, the cook, poked his head out, his face drained of color, his usual gruff confidence replaced by a flicker of unease. The officer's gaze swept the room, calm and methodical, like a hawk scanning a field before settling on its mark. His eyes found Linda's, and in that moment she felt exposed, as though he could see straight through her, through the years of early mornings, the endless pots of coffee, the quiet acts of kindness she'd never thought anyone noticed. He approached the counter with measured steps, each one steady and deliberate, as if he carried the weight of his purpose in him every movement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, but with a gravity that made her chest tighten. "Are you Linda Parker?" Her mouth opened, but the words stuck, tangled in a knot of nerves. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling around the damp rags she still held. "Yes, I am," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with a mix of curiosity and dread. The man introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Daniels, U.S. Army Special Forces. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew an envelope, its crisp edges pristine and formal, as though it had been crafted for this moment alone. Linda's knees wobbled and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, the worn wood grounding her as the room seemed to shrink around her. "I'm here because of a promise made to one of our own," the colonel said, his tone unwavering but laced with something softer, something that hinted at the weight of his words. Linda's heart stumbled, a cold wave of realization washing over her. She braced herself, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "You've been feeding Ethan Miller, haven't you?" the colonel asked, his voice gentle but direct. The name hit Linda like a stone dropping into still water, rippling through her memories. Ethan, the quiet boy with the too big jacket who came into the diner some mornings, his eyes downcast, his small frame hunched as if trying to disappear. She'd slip him extra pancakes, a glass of milk, maybe a warm smile when she could tell he needed it most. She never asked questions, never pried, but she'd seen the hunger in his eyes, the kind that went beyond an empty stomach. "Ethan?" she echoed, her voice cracking. "Is he?" "He's safe," the colonel reassured her quickly, sensing the panic rising in her. He's with his grandparents now, in Colorado. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived, chased by the shadow of what he hadn't yet said. "I'm here on behalf of his father, Master Sergeant Daniel Miller," the colonel continued, his voice thickening, betraying a flicker of emotion he'd clearly trained himself to contain. "He was deployed overseas. He didn't make it home." Linda's breath caught, a sharp, painful hitch that felt like it might split her open. The words landed heavily, each one a weight she wasn't prepared to carry. The colonel's eyes held hers, steady but kind, as he pressed on. In his last letter, Sergeant Miller asked that, if anything happened to him, we find the woman who made sure his son wasn't hungry. That we thank you properly. He extended the envelope toward her, and Linda's trembling hands reached out, her fingers brushing the paper as if it might burn her. It was heavier than it should have been, not just paper, but a vessel for something far greater. Gratitude, loss, a father's final thoughts of his child. Outside, the soldiers who had arrived with the colonel turned toward the diner's wide window. Their movements synchronized, deliberate. One by one, they raised their hands in a crisp salute, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. Inside, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Joe, the grizzled truck driver who always sat at the counter, stood slowly, his weathered hand pressing against the tabletop for support, his coffee long forgotten. Margaret, the librarian who came in every morning with her worn romance novels, followed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that caught the light. Even Ed, the stoic farmer, who never looked up from his newspaper, lowered it now, his jaw tight, his expression a mix of respect and sorrow. The regulars, who had shared countless mornings with Linda in this small, unassuming diner, rose to their feet, their movements slow and reverent, as if they too felt the weight of the moment. Linda stood frozen, the envelope clutched in her hands, her heart pounding so fiercely she was sure the entire room could hear it. For years, she'd been a quiet fixture in this town, invisible in her routine, pouring coffee, wiping down tables, sweeping crumbs from booths. She'd never asked for recognition, never thought her small acts of kindness mattered beyond the moment. But now, standing at the center of this silent tribute, she felt the enormity of it all. The envelope wasn't just paper. It was a father's gratitude, a soldier's sacrifice, a promise kept across miles and through the finality of death. She thought of Ethan, of his shy smiles, of the way he'd linger at the counter some days, as if the warmth of the diner could hold him a little longer. She thought of a father she'd never met, a man who, in his last moments, had thought of her, of the woman who fed his son. "I didn't do much," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible. I couldn't let him go hungry." The words felt inadequate, too small for the moment, but they were all she had. The colonel's gaze softened, and for the first time, a faint, solemn smile touched his lips. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "that's everything." The diner remained still, a tableau of quiet reverence. Colonel Daniels held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back, his movements precise but heavy with purpose. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady once more, "on behalf of the United States Army Special Forces, the brothers in arms of Master Sergeant Daniel Miller, and most importantly, on behalf of his son Ethan, we thank you." Without another word, he raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute, mirrored by the officers behind him. Through the window, the soldiers outside stood tall, their salutes unwavering, their figures framed against the gray morning sky. The room seemed to hold its breath. Chairs scraped softly as more regulars stood, their movements hesitant but resolute. Joe's hand rested over his heart, his weathered face etched with a quiet pride. Margaret's tears spilled over now, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Ed's newspaper lay forgotten on the table, his eyes fixed on Linda with a respect she'd never seen from him before. One by one, every customer in the diner rose, some pressing hands to their chests, others simply standing in silent solidarity, their eyes bright with emotion. For years, Linda had been the invisible thread holding this place together, her kindness unnoticed, her presence taken for granted. Now she stood at the heart of a moment she could never have imagined, holding a letter from a man whose name she'd never known, but whose gratitude had reached her across a divide she could barely comprehend. The envelope trembled in her hands, its weight a reminder of a father's love, a soldier's sacrifice, and a boy who'd found a moment of warmth in her diner. She didn't know what was inside it, words perhaps, or a message she wasn't sure she was ready to read, but she knew it carried more than she could ever have expected. It was a testament to the small, quiet acts that had defined her life, now seen, now honored, in a way that made her heart ache with both sorrow and pride. In the dim glow of the Maplewood diner's fluorescent lights, Linda Parker stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the worn edge of the countertop. Her throat tightened, a knot of emotion swelling as she looked out at the faces before her. Soldiers in crisp uniforms, their expressions a mix of gratitude and solemnity, and the regular patrons, their usual chatter stilled by the weight of the moment. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke, her eyes darting between the soldiers and the familiar faces of the townsfolk who had witnessed it all. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said softly, her words carrying a quiet conviction. "I just couldn't stand to see a child go hungry." Her heart ached as she thought of Ethan, the boy whose hollow eyes had met hers that day, his small frame hunched in the corner booth, clutching a single-dollar bill as if it were his lifeline. The memory of his hunger, his unspoken plea, had stirred something deep within her, a fierce, protective instinct that refused to let him walk away empty-handed. Colonel Daniels, standing tall with a face etched by years of duty, gave a subtle nod. His jaw was tight, not with anger, but with a respect that ran deeper than words could convey. He understood sacrifice, the kind that didn't ask for recognition. And in Linda's quiet act of kindness, he saw a reflection of the values he'd sworn to protect. "That's why we're here," he said, his voice low but firm, as if acknowledging that her simple gesture had reached far beyond the walls of this small diner. Behind him, the other soldiers stood in silence, their presence a testament to the boy Ethan, who was no longer just a stranger, but a son, a brother, a piece of their shared humanity. Each of them carried their own burdens, their own memories of leaving loved ones behind, and in Linda's act, they saw a flicker of the home they fought for. From the kitchen, Tom emerged, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the scene unfolding before him. The lines on his weathered face seemed less harsh today, his eyes lingering on Linda with a quiet pride he'd never voice. He glanced at the soldiers, then at the regulars, who sat frozen, their coffee mugs suspended midair. Tom, a man of few words, stepped aside without a sound, as if he knew this moment didn't need his usual banter or complaints. It was a rare pause for him, a man who had spent decades running this diner with a stern hand, and in that silence he offered his own form of respect. The air in the diner felt fragile, almost sacred, as if time itself had slowed to honor what had just transpired. Colonel Daniels lowered his salute, a gesture heavy with meaning, and for a fleeting moment he reached out, his hand resting gently over Linda's. The touch was brief, a second at most, but it carried the weight of gratitude, of shared understanding. Then with a sharp turn, he led his men out, their boots clicking softly against the tiled floor, a rhythmic farewell that echoed in the stillness. Outside, the black SUVs waited, their engines humming low, ready to carry the soldiers back to their world of duty and discipline. The doors shut with a deliberate thud, each one closing like the final note of a solemn ceremony. And just like that, they were gone, leaving behind a diner that felt forever changed. Inside, the silence held for a moment longer, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what had happened. Then slowly, life crept back in, forks clinked against plates, mugs were lifted to lips, and hushed conversations began to stir. But something had shifted in the air, a subtle transformation that lingered like the scent of fresh coffee. The Maplewood Diner, once just a quiet stop on Main Street, now carried a story that felt eternal, etched into its very foundation. Linda turned back to the counter, her fingers brushing over the envelope the colonel had left behind, its contents a mystery she wasn't ready to unravel. Her gaze drifted to the corner booth where Ethan had sat, his small frame dwarfed by the worn vinyl seat. She could still see him there, his eyes wide with a mix of shame and hope. Sometimes she thought, the smallest acts leave the deepest scars, not of pain, but of healing, of connection, of something profoundly human. In the days that followed, the diner became more than a place to grab a quick meal. It transformed into a beacon, a living testament to what kindness could do. Word of Linda's gesture spread like wildfire through the small town of Maplewood. By that evening, photos of the soldiers standing outside the diner flooded local Facebook pages, replacing the usual snarky comments with words of awe and admiration. One post, shared dozens of times, read, "Bless Linda Parker, proof that small towns still have the biggest hearts." The words warmed Linda's heart, though she'd never admit it, her humility a shield against the spotlight. The next morning, as she clocked in before dawn, she noticed something new, a small American flag carefully placed near the corner booth. Tom, gruff as ever, had hung it there, though he brushed off any questions with a shrug and a mumble. Below the flag, a simple brass plaque gleamed, its inscription a quiet tribute, reserved for those who serve and the families who wait. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a town's gratitude, a recognition of the sacrifices that bound them all. The diner's patrons began to change too. Customers started requesting seats near the corner booth, not for the view of Main Street through the smudged windows, but for the meaning it now held. Veterans passing through town made it a point to stop by, some leaving behind patches or unit coins, small tokens of their own stories. Young families came with wide-eyed children who pointed at the flag, their curious voices asking, "Why is it there?" Parents would pause, their answers soft and thoughtful, passing down lessons of compassion and sacrifice. The change wasn't just in the customers, it rippled through the town. Margaret from the flower shop began bringing a small arrangement every week, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it by the booth, her own way of honoring what Linda had started. Ed, a regular who had once scoffed at Linda's quiet generosity, left a $20 bill on the counter one morning without a word, his eyes avoiding hers as he shuffled out. Joe, a grizzled veteran who frequented the diner, organized a fundraiser at the local VFW, raising money for an emergency fund to support families with a parent deployed overseas. Linda, ever humble, helped organize it behind the scenes, her name never mentioned, but her heart woven into every detail. For Linda, the diner remained her world, a place where she poured coffee, wiped down counters, and greeted regulars with the same quiet diligence she always had. But something had shifted inside her, a subtle awakening. She wasn't a hero, not in her own eyes, yet she felt the ripples of her small act spreading outward, touching lives she'd never meet. Each morning as she unlocked the diner's door before sunrise, she'd glance at the corner booth and feel a warmth in her chest, a quiet understanding that her care for one boy had changed not just his life, but the heartbeat of an entire town. The booth was no longer just a table. It was a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest kindness could echo far beyond the moment it was given. As the seasons turned in Maplewood, Linda often found herself standing by the corner booth, her thoughts drifting to Ethan and the soldiers, to the flag and the plaque, to the way the town had rallied around a single act of compassion. She understood now that kindness was never wasted. It lingered, it spread, it circled back in ways she could never have predicted. In a world that often felt too fast, too divided, it was easy to feel invisible, especially as the years piled on. But Linda's story was a quiet rebellion against that invisibility. A warm meal, a kind word, an open seat. These were the tools of her revolution, small but mighty. The Maplewood Diner hadn't become a symbol of compassion because Linda set out to change the world. It happened because she chose to change one moment for one person, again and again, with a heart that refused to look away.